Hi, I'm Sean. I'm a senior at Evergreen. I'm currently in the Making and Writing Visual Culture program, where we've been investigating visual art through critical and psychoanalytic theory, while also investigating that theory through our own art practices. My own work at Evergreen has been focused on analysis of art, capital, and institutions to draw out threads of dialectical thought in the German idealist tradition. While dialectical thought is, to my mind, the only mode of thought adequate to investigating and comprehending questions of subjectivity in society and their negotiations, as anyone who's heard me harp on about Hegel knows, it's a type of thinking which can quickly get hairy, which is part of why I'm so excited to introduce a very clear and engaging speaker in Stefan to our art lecture series. Stefan's a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky with doctorates from Oxford and Vanderbilt. He's contributed to numerous journals, including Radical Philosophy, Critical Horizons, Philosophy and Social Criticism, and Public Reason. His book, Hegel, Freud, and Fanon, The Dialectic of Emancipation, shows how Fanon's view of the subject preserves insights of enlightenment while steering clear of racial prejudices which are endemic in European and American society. And he's currently engaged with Kant, Hegel, and hopefully today some more ordinary language of Stanley Cavell. So please welcome Stefan Bird-Pollan.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Thanks for that introduction. I also want to thank Kathleen and Shah for welcoming me and showing me sort of a great time. I've enjoyed being in a seminar on Monday, and I hope that some of the things we discussed there can sort of lead to a lively discussion after my paper is done. I just want to say at the outset that I'm going to sort of one positive thing and one negative thing. The negative thing is I'm not going to show you any images, and I'm sorry about that. I'll make clear why we're sort of at the pre-image level in this talk. But the good thing is that I'm not going to read my paper. And so you could look at me, and I hope I'll be lively enough. But with every positive, there's also a negative, which is to say that I'll be a little bit less precise when I talk through my paper. I hope that will be a benefit, because then you'll be able to ask me questions. I'll be a little bit repetitive, which is sometimes a virtue when you're sitting in the audience. So I'll speak freely here, and you can then ask me about points that are unclear. Okay, so let me introduce a little bit the problematic that I'm trying to engage in here, and the problematic I'm trying to engage in is why we even have aesthetic culture or need aesthetic culture, right? And so this is not an art lecture in the sense of talking about art. This is an aesthetics lecture in the sense of where does the need for art come from? And I will, of course, talk about film in the second half of my lecture, but the first half of my lecture is meant to ground the idea of the aesthetic. Now here I'll be coming from Kant. I'll be sort of mainly sort of channeling Kant through the work of Stanley Cavell, which I find to be a sort of a productive discussion of that, and then want to connect it to specifically the medium of film, although I'll talk about painting as well. And so I want this to be understood as both I guess I want this to be understood as sort of is in the spirit of transcendental philosophy, which is to say not transcendent philosophy, but transcendental philosophy. And transcendental philosophy, as I understand it, is about understanding the structures of our thinking, which can nevertheless be historical. So they're not prior to individual experience. They are produced by individual experience, but in a historically sort of fixed and firm way. And so what I'll be talking about is the time period of modernity where there is aesthetic culture. I'll be talking about sort of two sort of nestled historical time periods. One is sort of modernity in the broad sense, thinking about the beginnings sort of early modern period with Descartes for just a couple minutes, then sort of using Kant to think about this, and then I'll be talking about the art, the sort of the painting briefly of probably the 19th century. I think that's the best place to look at it. And then I want to talk about the ways in which film, as it occurs in the mid-20th century, is for Cavell a sort of a particular response to the problem of early modern and continuing problems of subjectivity. And so that's what I'm going to try to sketch out. So I'll talk first, as I said, about the sort of the philosophy, what is a subject, what is a modern subject, why does a modern subject need art, and then I'll talk a little bit about film in the second half. I'll try to go for about 50 minutes. We'll see how it goes, and we'll have enough time, I hope, for some discussion. As I said, this will be mainly sort of presented in the Kantian vein, but you can ask me, of course, about psychoanalysis and about Hegel and all those kinds of things as well, if you like. Yeah, so I mean, I'll be channeling Adorno here as well, but he won't make an explicit appearance. So let me start with the question of culture. So culture is the space that we find ourselves in, and culture is the way I'm understanding it, is the experience of having a subjectivity. Right? It's culture rather than radical subjectivity, right? Or knowledge about how the world is. So I want to locate culture as the thing in between. Just, I like what I like, right? And no one can tell me anything, or there are fixed rules of the world. I don't think that there ever was a condition in history where people just insisted on their subjectivity. They always had to go outside of themselves, right? But and I also don't think that there was ever a condition in history in which sort of God dictated all realms of life, all aspects of life. But I think we tend to think of the a medieval period as everything that came before modernity as a period in which heteronomy was more prevalent than autonomy. Okay, so if you want to put it in Kantian terms, culture is the condition of autonomy, which is to say the condition of having to make rules for ourselves. Right? And that's really a frustrating position to be in. It is both liberating, but it is an enormous amount of responsibility. Okay? And so what I sort of want to talk about is the ways in which we try to escape that responsibility. That's really, I think, where the aesthetic comes from. And I want to talk about how the aesthetic sort of presents us with ways of being released from the responsibility of having to make up our own minds. Right. So I'm talking about the ways in which the aesthetic develops as a way of alleviating the pressures of, let's call it, judgment. Okay, so judgment is the fundamental condition of having to connect, we say, intuitions with concepts, objects with concepts, however you want to talk about it, images with concepts, sensibility, right? That is to say, our animal nature with our supersensible, minded, more divine nature, something like that. There are a million different ways of putting it. So, but that's a problem, right? Because we're always both. We're both animal and also a sort of super sensible for Kant. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. So Kant has this vision in which we live in the age of enlightenment. Okay, and he's careful to distinguish the age of enlightenment from an enlightened age. Right? The age of enlightenment is an age in which we are trying to understand ourselves, trying to sort of come to the rules, figure out what the rules are by which we could most rationally live. Right? But Kant doesn't have this concept of the unconscious exactly, right? But he has the concept of feeling, and feeling is what pulls us away again from our rational side. Feeling is what rationality sort of tries to make rational, right? And so that process is the process of culture. Yeah. So that's really that's what I want to talk about. And so there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this. So let me just sort of introduce this a little bit. Stanley Cavell is a sort of 20th century philosopher who died only in the early 21st century. I think the book I'm talking about here is The Claim of Reason, which was published in the late 70s, mid-70s. And it's a sort of a Wittgensteinian account of skepticism. And one of the conclusions he comes to in this book is that skepticism, and I'll say a little bit more what that is something that is ineradicable. Okay, skepticism is ineradicable because subjectivity is ineradicable. And so what he tried to in this book are sort of two different ways in which we could try to get beyond skepticism, try to get beyond subjectivity. Okay, so what's skepticism? Skepticism is a sort of a philosophical formulation of the problem of subjectivity. And what's the problem with subjectivity? The problem with subjectivity is that we have the experience of having to make decisions that we keep on finding to be inadequate to our desires for knowledge and our desires for action. That's to say, we could say something like the unconscious or the feeling part of ourselves keeps on over-determining what we claim to know or why we claim to act. Right? And we yearn for a place in which our actions or our knowledge could be secure, could be certain, could be somehow proven to be the right kinds of things. Right? And so for Cavell, in the Claim of Reason, there are two modes in which this problem is addressed. The first one, he calls this the problem of the traditional philosopher. The traditional philosopher says, look, the problem of knowing the world and of knowing about other people, right? There's the two sets of problems, epistemology, moral philosophy, is to be settled by determining what the criterion for deciding what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, right? So we're looking for a criterion. Okay, the problem with the search for the criterion is that it iterates in some way, right? What's the criterion for the criterion? Right? You say, I'm going to call everything knowledge that I perceive directly, right? And then you have to ask, so what is it to perceive something directly? Well, okay, it turns out that's going to involve you in a whole complicated story, and it's just going to keep going down. So that is dissatisfying, right? That is sort of that gives rise to the figure of skepticism, right? Because it's to say, look, there is no way of actually determining how we can know other people, how we can even know ourselves, how we can know anything at all. Right? And the other mode, which Cavell associates with ordinary language philosophy, so Oxford philosophy, which is to say Austin and those people sort of who came out of Wittgenstein in a certain sense, is to say, look, it's all just a language game. So this would be a way of leaning into subjectivity. When skepticism tries to back away from subjectivity, ordinary language philosophy leans into subjectivity. Ordinary language philosophy says something like, well, look, when you ask me, what counts as knowledge, you're just asking about the rules of what counts in this particular situation as the rules for knowledge. And that seems in some ways fair, right? In some ways fair. So, if you ask me, why do I believe that my voice is here being transmitted on Zoom? I said, look, I have enough information that I can just trust this. And maybe in some deep, fundamental sense, we're all a brain in a vat, right? But actually, to me, that just doesn't matter. Right? For the purposes I have, this is a kind of pragmatism, right? For the purposes I have, the knowledge I have is sufficient, right? That's all that I need, okay? So, but there's also a problem with what he calls this imaginative projection. And the problem with the imaginative projection is that the language game is not self-standing. There is always going to be something which is outside of the language game, which is to say, there's always going to be something which is outside and is going to interrupt the language game, and you're going to say, oh, the language game didn't actually work in this case, right? And you can think of this as the kind of, I like to think of John Stuart Mill. When you read him, you get the sense that that it's so common sense. It's so common sense that what he's saying, that he thinks that all the chaps in the club will just sort of agree with him, right? And the problem, and that's a virtue, right? He says, yeah, this is common sense. The problem is, who's not part of the club, right? Who's not part of his upper class British English society, right? And so there are a lot of people who are going to be excluded from the language game. So the idea that it's all just a language game and that the language game is sufficient is insufficient, right? Because it is open to the skepticism. Right, so the skeptic will say, the language game is all very nice, but what about all the other people outside the language game? Right, and so for Cavell, this is sort of a structure that in each one is trying to overcome subjectivity in some form or another. Right, and so I think what we can say here is, in a general sense, each one is trying to overcome subjectivity. I said skepticism was trying to escape subjectivity, and ordinary language philosophy was leaning into subjectivity, but ultimately I think we can say that both are just sort of accepting subjectivity. Right? And so it's clear in the case of the ordinary language philosopher says, look, it's all just subjective, let's just make the most of it, and let's not worry about the people who are not playing the language game. That seems, in a way, irresponsible, right? The skeptic is right about that. The skeptic, on the other hand, yearns for this condition of absolute knowing, right? Or absent that, says, I can't know anything, right? But when you say you can't know anything, you still know something, which is to say you still sort of know yourself. And Cavell puts it like this. He says, it's as if by saying I can't know the world, I can know myself, right? Because that's what the skeptic says. I know that I can't know. Right? So it's just a solipsism. But the solipsism is also sort of an endorsement of this fundamental subjectivity. Right? And so what I want to say here is that both forms are sort of way of endorsing a kind of radical subjectivity, which ultimately is unsatisfying. Okay? And let me say a little bit more why it's unsatisfying. The idea of endorsing subjectivity fully, as it were, on the part of ordinary language philosophy leads to something that we might call like romanticism. Okay, romanticism is the idea that the self is the ultimate measure of the world. Okay, and that I am the creator of the world in some ways, right? That's what we have, and that is sort of more typically the kind of road into the aesthetic, we can say, right? But ultimately, that falls short, right? Because if I am the creator of the world, right, I will have to be satisfied with the world that I create. Yeah, but I'm not. It just doesn't seem enough. Right? And therefore, I think in a certain sense, we can say that I create this world, but it's not enough, and then I fall into depression. Right? I say, the world is not for me, right? I'm going to withdraw from the world. And so there's a deep disappointment inside romanticism, and you can always feel this in all these romantic works. I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of the German romantics, Novalis. There's a deep melancholia, right? So depression that they are experiencing, because there's this sort of moving back and forth between, what you call it, sort of manic depression, right? Between a kind of a projection into the world and a disappointment with that. I think also, right, the idea of skepticism is equally disappointing. Right? And I'm not 100% sure that this is going to fit, but I think you can associate skepticism with some kind of a notion of anxiety. Okay, and so what I'm thinking about here is anxiety in the sense that there are rules. Yeah, I just don't know what they are. Right, but I'm sure that there are rules. Right, and that's a very anxious kind of position. Right, the anxious position is the position of what are the rules? Well, if I only knew the rules, then I could live in the right way. Right, but the skeptic can't ever find rules that are satisfactory to them, and so also lives in this kind of condition of exclusion, of disappointment with the world, right? And so it's important that all of these are, as I say, forms of escaping subjectivity rather than in some sense facing up to subjectivity. Okay, so I want to say something about these are not meant to be, these two, I mean, I've used sort of, medical terms, right? Medical terms to sort of diagnose this. And these are not meant to be normative. They're meant to be sort of expressions of suffering, right? And I think modernity is about suffering from our uncertainty, suffering from a certain kind of disappointment. And Cavell says it's completely normal to want to escape our subjectivity, to want to escape this burden, right? Kant has a much more heroic conception of this. Kant thinks that, we just gotta suck it up and work through it, right? And that's how enlightenment happens. Enlightenment happens by sort of trying to overcome socially, right, individually and socially, trying to overcome this kind of depression or anxiety by knowing that the rules that we can have are limited, right? That's what the Copernican turn is meant to be. But at the same time, by saying, we are not going to let this get us down, right? We're not going to let the idea that we can only know objects according to our own particular laws of cognition. We're not going to let us get us down. Kant has this enthusiasm. Kant has this, heroic, as I said, conception of human motivation, right? But what comes after Kant, I think, is pretty quickly a sense that maybe we can't actually do this. We can't sustain this kind of effort to keep sort of acknowledging our limitations. And this leads into, I think, really all of the different brands of a German continental philosophy in the 19th and 20th century. This kind of problem. Okay, so the question is, how do we escape this, right? And so here I want to finally get a little bit to the idea of the aesthetic, right? So what happens in the aesthetic is that we are given a certain mode. We are confronted with a certain kind of experience, right? Which places our subjectivity in parentheses, right? Places it in epoche somehow, right? We experience the world as it really is in some sense, right? As if it were whole, as if it were harmonious. That is to say, as if we didn't have to make judgments about it, right? As if we didn't have to pretend it was a language game, as if we didn't have to pretend that it had criteria. The criteria seem to be delivered with the experience of beauty. Right? And so Kant talks about this maybe in terms of natural beauty. Paradigmatically that Kant talks about it in terms of natural beauty. But what you see when you see a beautiful, people always talking about sunsets, and it's true that they are beautiful. I don't know. I can't deny it. So let's stick with the sunset. Right? I mean, it's so banal, right? But at the same time, it is beautiful sometimes, right? And you stand there and you think, this is how the world is. The world, everything is in its place. There's nothing left for me to have to do in this experience, right? And so that means I'm rendered passive and I'm relieved from the constant struggle of either having to find the next move in a language game, right? Or of having to find the criterion for which which is going to undergird my judgment of how the world is, right? So just to put it in very simple terms, of the experience of beauty in the first moment, when I'm in it, interpretation is not necessary. Now, I don't want to say, of course, interpretation follows, right? But it follows only after the experience of beauty in this initial experience has subsided. Okay, and I think that's an important point. So in Kant, this is really a quite limited experience, right? Kant says that we, he says wir verweilen beim Schönen. I want to translate that as we are arrested by the beautiful. That's not the typical translation, but but I want the notion of remaining. right? Wir verweilen, that is to say, passively. Okay, and this allows me to say again, show what the problem again in subjectivity is, right? The problem in subjectivity is constant action, right? Constant movement. We're constantly trying to explain ourselves, trying to understand ourselves. It is so much work, okay? And in the experience of the beautiful, we are sort of at rest, just for a moment, and that gives us this enormous kind of relief, right? And so Kant is diagnosing this in sort of a transcendental sense. This is a transcendental structure. This can happen, okay? As such, I think, when I teach this material, students sometimes ask me, whether everyone has to have experienced the beautiful, and I'm never quite sure what to say, but I think I usually say something like, well, not everyone has to empirically have experienced the beautiful, although I find it hard that somebody might not have, right? But it is a capacity that we have, right? This is something that can happen to you that, something that has happened to, I think, all of us. That's why we're here, interested in the aesthetic, right? There's something about beauty that attracts us. Now, of course, beauty is not the same as art, right? And I'm gonna get to that in a second. But I just want to emphasize the passive nature of what's going on here, right? And so, again, the creation of beauty is the creation also. I think perhaps not all of you have read the Third Critique. Maybe you're about to read some of the Third Critique with Kathleen and Shaw, right? But the book is written as a sort of what seem to be two separate parts, right? There's one part which is about aesthetic judgment, and there's another part which is about teleology, okay? And so I just want to emphasize here that the experience of beauty, the experience of everything being in its place, is not just an experience of beauty, but it's also an experience of the world being whole. Right? And that is something that is actually really essential for the idea of science. Right? So when we make scientific, when there are scientific theories, right, they have to think of themselves, Kant says, they have to think of themselves as being part of a larger whole. Scientific theories don't think of themselves as being just piecemeal. They think of themselves as connecting to other theories. Right? So, quantum mechanics thinks of itself as being in some way related to geology. Not that the connection can necessarily be made, right? But the idea of a unified world is an essential aspect of this. Right? So I'm not going to talk about this much longer, but it's just to say that the experience of a unity, experience of a wholeness, is not restricted to just the beautiful or art, right? It is actually the condition for having a world as a whole, right? And again, usually we are just sort of actively trying to sort of connect things, put concepts together, understand our world. But we can only do that, Kant thinks, if underlying that is the idea of the world making sense as a whole, right? And that experiences the world being a whole which we could connect even, right? That is something that we lose in anxiety, and we lose that in depression, right? And so here, I don't know what science is able to do to buttress our feelings of wholeness. Yeah, I don't know, I haven't thought about that. Yeah. But we do know, I think we all probably think that art can do something to help us with that conception. And I'm trying to sort of locate that as connecting it also to sort of our broader ideas, right? So art is one of the places where we see that culture, we see that our world as a whole is a complete thing, and that connects art back to culture, to our general sort of mode of sort of facing our subjectivity, right? This is the issue. Okay, so yeah. So let me talk a little bit now. Let me come to it's 12 o'clock. Let me come to the film side, and so talk about this for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So I'll spend about 25 minutes talking about film. First, I want to talk a little bit about painting. Okay. So we have this problem, right? That's what I've been calling it anxiety or depression. We have this problem that we want wholeness, right? But we can't get it, right? We can only get it momentarily. We can only get it a little bit. And the question is, where do we get this wholeness from? Okay, so I think we can follow Cavell here. We can follow Hegel here. There is a sort of a history of the arts which come and go, right? And different arts provide particular accesses to wholeness at particular periods. I don't know that we should. I mean, I'm not going to tell people what they should worry about and what they can't worry about, right? But philosophically, I think it's perhaps not a terribly important question exactly how these different media, how these different forms of art take turns or how they coexist. That's not what Cavell is not terribly interested in, sort of seeing one art displacing the other. I think he says, look, the way that anxiety and depression is managed in the world just keeps changing for a lot of reasons, right? Political, social, epistemic, right? There are a lot of different reasons why ways of seeing, ways of knowing in the world change, right? And arts sort of develop in a way to address these. They're taken up, right? Because they happen to be addressing certain kinds of things, right? The reason that film is attractive is because of certain kinds of social conditions. It's not that film is attractive as it's in itself. It's not that painting is attractive in itself. Painting is a response to a certain kind of way that the skeptical problem of, or that the problem of ordinary language, or the problem, as it were, of subjectivity itself, is expressed in a particular time. Right? That's the point. So we live through a particular mode of subjectivity, and somehow there seems to be a way in which there's an expression of the arts which can satisfy us momentarily. Okay, right? So for many of us, painting is paradigmatic. I don't know much about music, but I think we all hear music and find that it satisfies us in certain moods. And I mean, so I can't theorize that. Cavell does know a lot about music, but he's not talking about music here. He's talking about film. So let me talk a little bit about this. In particular, I want to talk briefly about the relationship between a painting and film. Okay, so there is this story in which film it displaces painting. Okay, that is not Cavell's story. Now, there are stories to be told about that. Those can be compelling. It is not Cavell's story. Cavell wants to say that they exist in parallel. Those two media, and this is what I want to say. So painting. In the 19th century, which is what we're talking about here, Cavell thinks, has no longer delivers the kind of alleviation of subjectivity. It no longer delivers the release from subjectivity that is needed. And so painting was already on its way out in the 19th century. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, I think maybe a simple way of putting the point is that painting no longer has the capacity to make us passive. Okay? That is to say, well, look, you know this. You know this already. Because you look at a Malevich, yeah? Or at a Rothko. Maybe a Rothko is a little more difficult. You look at a Malevich or it's some abstract painting, and you have to say, What do you say? You say first, this is interesting. You say interesting. Okay, that's a little bit non-committal, right? You say, I'm trying to. When you say interesting, you're buying yourself time to find your way into the painting, right? To understand what is going on there, right? How is this thing that other people find really important and interesting? How is this interesting for me? Right? And we have, I think all of us have done a lot of work in looking at paintings and trying to figure out what's going on in them, right? How do they relate to me? Now, what is that kind of an activity? That is very active. It is hard work. Okay? That is not taking me away from my subjectivity. That is just increasing the pressure on my subjectivity. Right? I have to be superhuman in some sense, right, to understand what's going on in a Malevich painting. Yeah? Right? So painting fails to make me passive, fails to bring the world to me. I have to do all the work. So it's really, in that sense, super romantic. Yeah? And then you say, oh my God, I just can't understand it. Right? I can't understand the Malevich, and then you say, now I'm depressed. Right? Or you're anxious because everyone else seems to understand the Malevich, right? But I can't get it. I'm the idiot here. Right? This is not helping you. Yeah? This is not helping you escape from the problem of subjectivity. Yeah? And so Cavell's story is that this has already been going on since, I mean, he follows Michael Fried, and who thinks that this is already starting in the 18th century. And we were talking about Goya yesterday. I mean, there are already abstract paintings in the 18th century, right? I mean, yeah, I was just in Madrid seeing a bunch of those Goyas. I mean, they could have been painted in 1910, right? Anyway, okay, right. So the point is that the painting no longer delivers the kind of passivity that we crave, and in that way, it has to radicalize itself. It's already on its way out. Okay, so now the question is, if the goal really is the experience of some kind of passivity, right? How does film deliver on that? That is the real question, and that is the question that Cavell, I think, wants to explore in the World Viewed. That's the important question he wants to address here. Okay, okay. I'll take a sip of water and then talk about film for a little bit. Okay. What I'd like to emphasize here first is, again, that distinction that I made earlier on when I talked about the beautiful and then the subsequent interpretation. Okay? Which is to say, Cavell doesn't want to deny that film can be interpreted and can call upon our subjectivity the way all other arts can and have to be. Film has to be interpreted, of course. But he's talking about a position from which film is interpreted. Okay, so I want to talk about that. I want to distinguish between the ontology of film, that is to say, the being of what is to be interpreted, right? That makes a difference, and then the interpretation, which I think we can sort of, in some ways, do in the same kind of way. Of course, films can be interpreted along the lines that paintings can be interpreted. You can use the same sort of skills, right? And in fact, often you do, right? I mean, of course, there's motion, so there's a whole different kind of language that is laid on top of that, right? But if you look at a film still, and this is something I could have maybe shown, but it would have taken a long time, right? You can look at the symbols and the different kinds of construction and framing, right? You can talk about all those kinds of things, but what we're talking about here is the immediate access, the place from which you are interpreting. That's what's different, right? And so for Cavell, fundamentally, what we have in film is, for whatever reason, is an experience that reality is given to us immediately. That's what I want to say. That's what Cavell wants to say. Reality is given to us immediately. And so what I'll try to sort of talk about here is how reality is given to us immediately in film, and what that means for our epistemic and also for our moral relation to what is being depicted. Yeah, and then this is a kind of a release. This is kind of satisfaction which people crave and what people are finding in film. Okay, so what I mean by this kind of satisfaction, is that in film we don't just have the experience of having to do the work. we also have the experience of reality telling us what it means without us having to do the work. Okay, so the passivity is one part that is experienced in watching the film. Our passivity, the immediacy of knowledge occurs, right? The immediacy of knowing the characters on the screen, and also the immediacy of knowing the objects on the screen. That's what's there. And then we have subjectivity, which responds to that. Yeah, and that Cavell thinks is sort of the right way, allows us to sort of reconfigure ourselves, to get out of that spiral of subjectivity. Okay, so let me guide us through that a little bit more in a kind of more deliberate way. Okay, so remember at the beginning, right? I was talking about the problem of judgment. The problem of judgment is how to connect the intuition to the concept. Yeah, and in some ways, that's that's something that we have to learn, right? That's something that we have to learn. But at the same time, Cavell thinks that is something that we are not sufficiently puzzled by, right? We are able to do this. Right? We are able to connect the image to the concept in ways that are sort of intuitive, not problematic, right? So he talks about the children at a very young age, right, no longer not being puzzled by being told a photograph is of their grandmother. Right? I mean, a photograph is not the grandmother, yeah, and yet children sort of understand that it's of their grandmother in a very simple, immediate way. They understand that the connection between the concept and the intuition, right? The concept and the image in a way which makes Cavell think, well, this is something that our culture has somehow prepared us for. Okay, he doesn't go into an explanation of why that is the case, but it just is the case, sort of phenomenologically, it's the case that we can identify the concept and the intuition in an image in a relatively unproblematic way, right? Whereas in real life, we have to there's a whole problem of how you teach someone something, right? And so the one way of doing that is by using a language game, through a language game. The other one is through ostensive definition, where you just point, right? You point to a chair and you say, this is a chair. But the question is, when you point to a chair, what are you pointing at, right? People already have to know what you're pointing at. So you're again in the problem of the criteria, or the criterion, right? And in the language game, you already have to be in the language, right, in order for this all to make sense. Right? You already have to be a competent speaker in order to be given the definition. Yeah? But in the image, in the photograph somehow, you just sort of get it. Right? And that's, I think, for Cavell, something that is really quite amazing and quite interesting, and that is the jumping off point for him to sort of want to talk about film. Okay, so why is that? What is it that's happening here? Okay, so I've been talking about escaping subjectivity. Let me just read a little passage so you can see that I haven't been making this up entirely. Okay, so Cavell says, so far as photography satisfies a wish, it satisfies a wish not confined to painters, but the human wish intensifying in the West since the Reformation to escape subjectivity and metaphysical isolation. A wish for the power to reach this world, having for so long tried, at last hopelessly, to manifest fidelity to another. Okay, that is to say, well, I guess as I've been saying, film, the image in photography satisfies a problem, satisfies this release from subjectivity. Okay, so we've talked about painting. We can say sort of schematically, right, the painting sought our presentness to the world, that is to say, painting sought to sort of satisfy our desire for having a world and sort of supplies a world for us, okay? Whereas what we're looking for is the world to be present to us, right? That's what the experience is in the beautiful is, right? That the world is present to me. Right? Not that I have to do all the work to make the world present, so make myself sort of the standard of the world sort of delivers itself to me, right? Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about the kind of technical, well, not technical, the kind of sort of broadly epistemic and moral reasons we're talking about this. Okay. Okay. Here, let me move along here a little bit. Okay. So the question is, how is the passivity that I've been making so much of, how is that assured in film? Right? So how is the passivity delivered? Again, in painting, right? Painting invites your imagination, invites you to see things. You see a world in the painting, and you think, so what's behind that, right? I mean, and paintings even sometimes, you know, early modern paintings, especially of the Stations of the Cross, will like show you a mini short story inside the painting, right? And it'll go from left to right. There'll be the different stations, and they'll actually be it's like a cartoon, really, right? It's like different little panels inside one painting, and you'll be told to follow this, and that will not just put you in mind of the Stations of the Cross, right? That will put you in mind of the whole symbolic universe of Christianity. Right? So there you will be invited to think, invited to reflect further. Right? What film does in Cavell is to inhibit that. That's one of the key things. So what a film or a photograph does is it makes an image, and then it's cropped. Right? So it's cropped, and what's outside, right? We just don't have any access to. We don't know what's outside, right? There's just no way of knowing. We could imagine it, right? But somehow that doesn't feel like it's in the spirit of the film. The film is focusing your attention on a particular slice of life. It's excluding you from all the rest. Right, so whereas the painting gives you sort of a whole world in a nutshell, the film gives you only the detail and says that's all you get. Right, there's no reality to the rest. Right, that just doesn't exist, and so what does that really? That relieves you of a certain kind of responsibility. Right? You are limited to interpreting, to understanding only that little fragment that you've been given. Right? So that's a really important aspect that you get here in film for Cavell. Right? And so what Cavell wants to say is we're confined by the film. Right? We're confined by the photographic image, and then he's sort of fond of puns. He likes to say that in film we are screened from the world. That is to say that we are excluded from the world. Film presents us with a world in which our subjectivity is excluded from having an effect on us. Right? And so this is a way in which we are made passive. The photographic image then, right, zeroes us in, focuses us in. This is the image. This is have a perfect attention, right? A perfect attention which we can't have in ordinary life, because in ordinary life, one aspect draws us to another aspect, right? We get this metonymic, metaphorical relation to everything, and it becomes a sort of a confusing mess ultimately, right? We try to structure it, but we don't know where the limits are. Right? In film, we have this kind of complete end here. Okay, right? And the way this is done, right, for Cavell is but what he calls through automatism. Now, automatism isn't anything to do with the machine of the camera, right? But it is to do with the fact that the recording only records a limited view. Right, that is all there is. There is only that, and there's no way of going back. It's like the past, he says. The image on the screen is like the past. We can't go back to anything around it. And so this is where, so I've been talking to Kathleen about fantasy, and I think one of the important things for Cavell here is that this is, the screen image gives you an image that is like a fantasy, except not one that you can explore like you can explore your own fantasy or your own dreams on the couch. Yeah, so that's a real difference. There's nothing beyond that. You can explore your associations with the image, right? But not what is next to the image, what is behind the image, what else might have happened. That, again, in that way, also it relieves you from a certain kind of interpretive burden. Yeah, so I think that's really important to notice this. Okay, so that's the epistemic side. Let me just talk for 1 minute about the sort of the social, political, or moral side of things, and then we can maybe open it up for some questions. Okay, so the epistemic world is exhausting for us, but what's even more difficult, of course, is knowing other people. Right, that's really a lot of work because they're way more complicated than inanimate objects that we deal with, right? And so, one of the things that Cavell wants to emphasize is that on screen, you sort of know the people on screen, right? They're not friendships with characters. Right? But you have your favorite TV shows or your favorite movies. You feel like you know the people. You say, what would the Big Lebowski do in this situation? Right? And then you think, okay, well, what would the Big Lebowski do? And then you imagine something, and you know the Big Lebowski, yeah? And yet, you don't know the Big Lebowski, right? Because the Big Lebowski is Jeff Bridges and a fictional character, right? But they're unified in some way. And so Cavell wants to say, the Big Lebowski lives and dies with Jeff Bridges. And Jeff Bridges also lives and dies with the Big Lebowski. Yeah? They are connected. They have been connected through film because that has created this kind of third thing, right? Which is neither of those two, but which is knowable. It's a human something, right? The Big Lebowski, the fictional character, is a human something that is just like a human, like someone, but yet also knowable, right? If I know all the lines of the Big Lebowski, then inevitably when someone says, what would the Big Lebowski do? Well, then I would just say, sometimes I get Walter's and the Big Lebowski's lines confused, so I'm not gonna make any mistakes about that here by quoting from memory. But, right, I mean, I know what the Big Lebowski would say, but that's all. There's a limited palette, so I can really know the other on screen. That is something that is another feature that is really important for Cavell. We can know the other. The problem about other minds, of how to know the other, is also solved on film. So it's not just an epistemic problem that's solved, it's also a moral problem that's solved. Yeah? It's not solved forever, because of course, right? We start worrying about it. We think about it. Is there an interiority to the Big Lebowski? I mean, like, what's the backstory? But in a way, that's not something we can really answer, right? We know we're speculating, right? Well, when we're thinking about someone else, we can call it speculating, but what we're really doing is wild psychoanalysis, right? We're imagining someone's childhood trauma or whatever it is and saying, well, that could have been, right? It could have been, but there's no could have been for the Big Lebowski's childhood. What made him like that? Well, we just won't know, dude, right? And okay, well, with that, let me close. Thanks very much. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's really timely for me and for some of my students who I hope are attending on Zoom, because we've been reading The Poetics of Space, Bachelard, and he is, this is book length in a way, meditation, you could say, on the poetic image. And he sort of objects repeatedly to psychoanalysis and psychology for the tendency, because he wants to introduce something like the sunset that you bring up, which could be in the form of a memory or a poem or an encounter with art that stops, in a way, stops the mind. It's an encounter. And so he wants us to kind of dwell and pause before all the interpretive that the psychoanalytic can do, that can open things up or shut things down, depending on how good the analytic is, I guess. And you know, sometimes one and sometimes the other. But your talk helped me think about, so this kind of wholeness thing, and the exclusion that you talked about with regards to film, which through Cavell, which, you know, in a way we could just say this is spectatorship, right? This is what it means to be a spectator, is to be excluded. And this kind of, whereas the painting in your talk is an inside. It's you're included. You're on the inside. And this, I think, is what Bachelard is up to as well, is that there's the poetic image it's above all for him, and this is his key word, intimate. It's an intimate immensity. And so my question really has to do with kind of a third possibility for subjectivity, that through, well, in Bachelard's case, phenomenology, you wouldn't have to escape subjectivity, but you could move into and through and use subjectivity to deepen what he calls the intimate immensity of the encounter with the poetic image. And for him, this has everything to do with space. And so, yeah, I
That's great. I mean, that's exactly, I didn't get to go there, but maybe this is an opportunity for me to say something a bit about what the achievement of film actually is. In a further step, it's exactly what you say. Using Bachelard, that's interesting. I haven't read Bachelard in a really long time, so I should look at that. But it's the experience of escaping subjectivity in film isn't so much an escape as putting you on the right footing with your subjectivity. That is to say, there's a passive moment here of you being unseen, of experiencing it, and then there's, of course, the subsequent active moment of you interpreting, of you understanding, right? So there's the experience, which is sort of this ontological passivity, which is, Kant would call it receptivity. But the receptivity is what allows the spontaneity of mind, the interpretive process, to actually do the right kind of work rather than just being an interpretation of its own subjectivity. You are able to interpret the world from the perspective. And so in subsequent work, not in the world viewed so much, but in Pursuit of Happiness and in Contesting Tears, Cavell wants to talk about film as putting us in a position to reevaluate epistemic norms, social norms, from this position of seeing them, as it were, for the first time on screen, right? So he wants to talk about marriage and remarriage and the marriage contract in the 30s and 40s as being presented to us in film in a way that allows us to see that it's something that is both important, but also something that is up to be renegotiated, and that's the sort of political contribution of film. And that's where I think he goes beyond Kant in an interesting way, because Kant doesn't think that the aesthetic is the beautiful, is the symbol of the morally good, but he doesn't elaborate what it would mean to sort of make a move outside after that. So there is that third form of subjectivity, which is active and productive in some sense. So. Yeah.
So I'm Eric Stein. I teach anthropology and history, and I'm teaching a program on play right now. And right now we are considering virtual worlds, and we are watching a film tomorrow. It's by the anthropologist Tom Belstorff. It's called Our Digital Selves, My Avatar is Me. And so as I'm listening to your entire talk, I'm thinking, how much of this can I plagiarize tomorrow when I set up the film, and to what extent can this sort of even be imposed on that framework? Some of the things that you were talking about were surprisingly helpful.
I'm also surprised.
Thank you. Problem of knowing other people, what is true, false, good, or evil. So this is about Second Life, where people just encounter each other through avatars. And the film is focusing on the experience of people with disabilities who have mobility issues, and this is one of their sort of main ways to connect with other people. And of course, there are trolls and scammers and all those things. And I guess I'm just trying. I don't know. I need help thinking. How much of this makes sense. And this is probably unfair to you because you didn't come here thinking about Second Life and virtual worlds. But sort of the shift from the painting to film. This is another kind of shift that requires and perhaps produces a different kind of passivity through encounter with the aesthetic. There's one scene where the Yosemite is recreated. I'm like, oh, this is a Kantian sublime, or is it? I don't know. What is this?
Yeah, right.
So I don't know if you've thought through any of this, or maybe this is the.
Well, okay. So thank you for that question. So there's a usual response that is given to what you said, which is to say, Cavell is not thinking. I mean, obviously, he's not thinking about cartoons. Right, so he's not thinking about this kind of digital world that you're talking about. And so that doesn't fit within his purview, so he doesn't really have anything to say. However, I don't really like that response. That response seems to me to come out of a kind of literal-mindedness about the photographic image. And what it does to you, but it does require us to think at a deeper level, which is to say, think about spontaneity and receptivity. So I haven't made the connection. So you're putting me a little bit on the spot, and that's totally fine. I haven't made the connection between sort of the image as receptivity and other forms of deeper receptivity. But I think that one of the questions that might come up in this sort of a second life question is where where the receptivity, where the passivity does erupt. What are the non-negotiable aspects of that of the kind of second life? What are the limits of the avatar? What are the limits that are accepted of the avatar, right? And so I think we have so much activity, so much spontaneity, and it overwhelms us, right? And so it seems like video games, virtual worlds are all spontaneous, are all just subjective. Right? But I think that can't be the case. That can't be the case. In the subjective, sort of spontaneous world, there has to be something which is making the spontaneity be able to be spontaneous. That is, make it work. Because otherwise, it would be, without the receptivity, without the passivity, it would be meaningless. Right? And so presumably one of the things that you're interested in showing this is to find out where the meaning is to say where the norms are that are undergirding the whole system. Right? They can't just be imagined away. And if it's to the extent that it's real people being these avatars, there are real norms undergirding these avatars. And they're just being manifest in different ways, right? So the image is always, in some sense, a projection of the psyche, of what the psyche is sort of passive to and what it wishes for itself. Now, I don't know how to do that in terms of the difference between, the visual image of the photograph and the kind of creation of the avatar. But you're an anthropologist, so that would be really interesting to hear what you find in that kind of what kind of receptivities you find, what kind of passivities you find about that. So, yeah, Kathy.
So thank you so much, Stefan. This is fantastic, and I'm definitely going to talk to you all day about it. So right now, I'm just going to restrict myself to one one question, and I'm not even sure it's the one that makes sense yet to me, so bear with me. I've been thinking about the photograph of the grandmother, right? And this has to do, by the way, with the question of how passive the moment is or is experienced as when we encounter something we think is beautiful. And you sort of went with a retranslation of the phrase about, well, like it's normally translated, you said it rests us, right? It's like a resting point.
Yeah.
And I usually really
Arrest
put a,
us, yeah.
is that's what you said?
I said
right?
arrest, yes. Like
Yeah. Not, oh, you said arrest?
arrest.
Oh, I heard kind of a babyish, like rest, like a nap or like.
You heard what you wanted to
I
hear.
heard what I wanted to hear. Oh, interesting. I wrote down what rests us. Okay, this is interesting because right, you wanted, I think, to at least emphasize this moment of stoppage.
Yeah.
Right, a stopping point. Whether we got arrested or whether we got to take a nap, one way or the other, we got a moment away from some other activity.
Right.
And I normally put a lot of emphasis on the word lingering in that same moment in Kant, which is like a kind of restful activity, but it is also more active sounding than being arrested. It's less, and I often talk about this as a moment in history when before lingering became malingering. You were still like allowed like to cultivate a kind of lingering response in an aesthetic way prior to action, right? So, and for you, the sequence of stoppage to action seems really important. You're only going to be able to go on to reevaluate the conditions for recognizing or informing a good marriage, right? Like to reevaluate what that relationship might look like, right? If you've had a kind of stopping point.
Yeah.
And so this all probably makes sense to you. Here's the weird connections, right? I was thinking about the image of the grandmother and the child who sort of is like, maybe for a minute flummoxed when someone says, hey, look, it's your grandmother. They're like, this is a photograph, it's not my grandmother, right? Like, but they quickly come to realize it is my grandmother. There's a kind of identity there. And I was thinking, well, that same kid, and this is a kind of psychoanalytic term, that same kid would not be as easily pacified if they were crying and you said, but here's your mother, right? And it's a photograph of the mother, right? You're like, so I guess I was thinking about this need for a kind of, like that's a kind of ambient comforting figure is the grandmother for this child I'm imagining in the scene that I'm painting with this kid and that particular grandmother. It's not every grandmother who's comforting either, but like the grandmother doesn't offer kind of immediate, I mean, if you're a baby, doesn't offer immediate sustenance, likely unless they're a primary caregiver and happen to be in that role, but it's not, it's generally kind of one degree of remove from a kind of parental care. You mentioned metaphor and metonymy, and I was thinking that's a nice metonymic distancing, right? Whatever it is we're getting in this sort of moment of happiness, it's not the satisfaction itself, right? It's not being cared for directly. It's not becoming one with your mother again. It's not a unity like that. It's not being absorbed. I mean, right, like the longing for being worlded again where you were like, given your food and your love were in the same place, right? Like all of those things were happening I mean, that's a kind of total unity. So I guess I wondered what you thought about, like, first of all, that's a weird set of thoughts.
Great question.
You do what you want
Great
with them.
question, Kathleen.
Okay.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, my first thought is that the mother doesn't solve the problem either.
No, of course.
I mean, right? Yeah, no, I mean, so, you know, the problem here is that after the separation from the mother, after the original unity is over, it's all just representations of unity, right? So, and look, we maybe you have a smartphone on you, maybe you have a photo of a loved one on there, maybe it's even your whatever home screen or something, right? I mean, so you know, we all do this, and who's to say that the photo of the grandmother won't soothe the child? Or who's to say that the appearance of the actual mother will? Right? So but I want to say a second thought, which is to say that maturity means the ability to be sustained by an ever more attenuated representation. Right? And I think that's sort of what Kant thinks. Kant thinks, you know, we move from being satisfied by our mothers to sort of finding the moral law to be the most meaningful thing, right? And of course, no one ever gets all the way to the moral law, right? But you can think of the presence of the physical presence of the mother, the representation of the mother, the representation of someone else, you know, as sequences in this kind of being able to be satisfied by something else. And there again, look, I think the key point here is that you want something that is satisfying, that is at the right level of your maturity, right? And there's a satisfaction that we experience in film, I think, that speaks to a more basic level of satisfaction than we might experience in Malevich, right? If we're highly evolved, okay, right, we find, oh man, Malevich, oh, this is just the best, right? But there are very few people who are like highly evolved like that, right? And so we all really just want our moms, but that's not you can't have a functioning society if that's the level you're at. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and can I just say, I think then, right, that it's always just a promise of happiness still, and
Yeah.
not actual, like also for
Yes.
Like that was sort of the end of it.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. It's not actual happiness. It's just a kind of promise. Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions on the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on Zoom, feel free to post your questions or comments. And there are two different ones, and I'm interested in maybe how they relate in around the question of the work of subjectivity. So there's one about film and one about painting. So maybe I'll bring them together. So Matt asks, I'd love to hear you speak more about the philosophy behind The Big Lebowski. The dude is reminiscent of Jesus, and there's much in the way of Western religion represented there. Any thoughts to this? And then the second one is from Tom. Thanks for being here. A bit of a precise question. You gave German Romantic painting as an example for the thinking around I'm the creator of the world. Do you have an art movement or artwork you see as an example of the anxious and skeptic position? Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So I'm probably not going to offer an interpretation of The Big Lebowski here, just off the cuff. It's a movie I've thought a lot about, but I'm still very much in the thinking about it. Okay. So what am I thinking of in terms of romantic painting? I was also thinking really about. Storm and Stress, Sturm und Drang, thinking about the sorrows of young Werther. But also there's and I'm blanking on the artist, of course, the famous image above the clouds, the Caspar David Friedrich painting, right? And that's taken as an image of the sublime, right? And the sublime is meant to be sort of an invigorating experience, right? You are supposed to see yourself in some sense equal to nature, equal to what nature has to throw at you, right? But at the same time, that is a momentary experience before you say, oh shit, I guess I'm really not up to it. The storm is coming. I'm getting wet. I better get out of here, right? So I think that there's that sort of elevation of the sort of romantic sort of I'm equal to it, and then there's pretty quickly a deflation of that romantic movement, which is why I think romanticism is always kind of manic depressive. I think you see this not just in the story. I mean, you see this in the stories, but also you see this in the writers that are sort of by turns, devoid and also sort of inspired, right?
And I think the other side of Tom's question was, so that's the romanticism side,
Yeah.
and what about, do you have a movement that you equally relate to the kind of skeptical position?
Oh, skeptical position. Oh, yeah.
Or the ordinary.
Right,
one,
yes.
sorry. I messed it up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. I think, the obvious thing to say would be classicism, right? And the sort of humanistic ideal. And I mean, you think of Goethe here. I'm not. I think in visual art it's a little bit more difficult because the classicism in visual arts is an earlier more in disrepute kind of movement. But I think of the kind of, I think of Goethe again, the ideal of order, the ideal of classical sort of rhyme, and I'm now forgetting all my poetics terms. That's a position that might well make you anxious, right? If you can't quite write like Goethe, and Goethe, and Schiller. I mean, Schiller was sort of made fun of, I think, because I forget exactly where he's from, but some of the early poems only rhyme if you say it in the dialect of where Schiller is from, right? So there's this sort of, there are rules out there, and you better conform to them. Otherwise, you're going to be made fun of, even if you're a genius like Schiller. So I do think that skepticism and classicism could be related in a way. I haven't. It's been a while since I was up on that material. Oh yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. So I'm thinking about this idea of like the photographic image as being as like satisfying in some way the problem of our subjectivity. And I'm thinking, that made me think about like the concept, it made me think about like Susan Sontag and Walter Benjamin, who both wrote about photography specifically. Susan Sontag would compare some photographs, like popular photographs, or images, photographic images, to sound bites. Walter Benjamin would talk about the photographic image in, it's like the age of mechanical reproduction. It's like as a tool of oppression, and so it's like I'm wondering how is that mechanism of like passivity part of that? Is like, or is do you see what I'm trying to say?
I have some things to associate with here, and you can tell me if I'm associating in the right direction. Let me talk about Benjamin a little bit. Like Benjamin, right, is deeply ambivalent about the power of the photographic image. Yeah, I mean he mourns the loss of the aura, but also thinks it has to be overcome, right? Because what happens if the image of the painting of the church, right, of all the kind of retrograde historical, sediment that always just overwhelms us, right? I mean, these Renaissance, early modern paintings are both works of genius and also, in some sense, didactic, right? They're teaching you about your place in the world in some ways, and that is their power, that is their strength, right? So they are organizing you in some way, and that is something that we crave, right? So that's why Romanticism is not something bad; it is helpful, right? It's really something we want, yeah. Skepticism, I'm a little bit less sure of. But anyway, in arts, Romanticism has been the major influence, right? Because we're already so alienated. Romanticism is giving us a place to be, right? And yet, right, if we want to have political change, we're going to have to break with Romanticism in some way. And I think he does think that the photographic image is capable of transforming us, of pulling us out of the out of our individual subjection to the painting, right? I mean, how should I put it? I think the idea is that when you see a painting, right, you're supposed to be put in mind of the crucifixion and of your higher calling in some way, right? But each in your own kind of way, right? That's what Protestantism does. And by separating us in that way, it subjects us each individually, right? We each become neurotic in our own kind of way, and therefore separate and easier to control. I think that's sort of what Benjamin thinks, right? But capitalism controls us in the same way, right? Capitalism is an equalizer. It breaks the aura, Yeah, if we each suffer the same fate, as it were, on the assembly line. And then that's a possibility of bringing us together. Now, question is, can we be brought together at the level of social action, of the imagination, collectively? Right? And so I think these things, film might be able to do that, right? Because in film, we see the same image, right? It's not, look, this is a little bit difficult. I haven't thought this through. But what I'd like to say is that Benjamin has a sort of a proto-Cavelian conception of the photographic image. And in fact, and I have not gotten to read this yet either, late in his life, Cavell started becoming much more interested in Benjamin as well. So I think there's an affinity there, because I think that Benjamin sees the equalizing power, the objectivity of the photograph, right? And thinks he can make that into something. So there's certainly a paper, book to be written about Cavell and Benjamin with regard to sort of instrumentalizing, sort of, or the ontology of the photographic image is making a certain kind of social praxis possible. But Benjamin didn't live to really work out the theory, so all we have is fragments. Of course, that's probably all we would have ever gotten. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in that, and contrast with the like Sontag and other writers have talked about the illusion of objectivity in the photograph. We'll never know what's outside of it. It's just in the frame. When she talks about the photograph as a soundbite, that's it's usurping the power of. That's not quite the word I'm looking for, but it's taking that powerful characteristic of photographs of looking at it and being this is objective. To be that's why she compares them to sound bites. This is all it has to say. You know, it's but then in doing that, she's reminding us that, that to question the images we see, things like that. But isn't that awareness, doesn't that rob the photograph of its power of that moment of arrestation?
Yeah, so this is another important aspect that I didn't really get to talk about. Cavell thinks that the kind of image I was talking about today really ends by the 60s. Post-60s, which is to say when Sondheim was writing about the image, right? Sontag is writing about the image. It has become much more subjective again, right? The image is no longer universal. It no longer satisfies the cultural need, or is no longer able to satisfy the cultural need. The way painting also sort of just died away in a certain sense, because it became too subjective, too interpretive, right? And so I think that is just. There's nothing you can do, right? So it just sort of ended. Benjamin died at what Cavell thinks is sort of the height. He was always in Europe, right? He was looking at German films and French films. Cavell was looking at American films, and that's also something that's important. But they were looking at mid-century films, watching mid-century films, which had a certain kind of power that then ceased to be, right? It just couldn't sustain itself any longer. And look, I do not want to talk about images of these films from the 30s and 40s in any way connected to what we're looking at in terms of our smartphones, right? Those are completely different images, not because they're different images, but because we just have a completely different relationship to them, and that makes them different images, right? It's just completely different. So in a way, film is a thing of the past already, right? It's been over, in a way for 50, 60 years, in the way that I was talking about it today. Yeah. Although I just want to add, Cavell thought that in 100 years, we would still be watching Groundhog Day. So that is... Well, if you've seen it, it is really truly a great movie, especially on rewatching. Yeah, it really does get better every time you watch it. Yeah, done. funny because it's true. It really, yeah. But that's, you know, I mean, so things can still happen, but film can't galvanize a culture anymore. Right? And I think that's one of the puzzling things that the Cavell wants to say against, you know, these sort of end of art folks. He wants to sort of give them something. He says, yeah, it's true that the film is over. On the other hand, it did play an important role for, you know, 30, 40 years. And that's actually surprising when you read Hegel, when you read Adorno, when you read Heidegger. But Benjamin is with him. Yeah. Benjamin is with him. He thinks also film can do something for us, you know.
I also think that there's obviously films that are still being made now, and even like non-narrative and all sorts of films that can be very impactful. But I think maybe something I can't say this confidently. Maybe something they have in common is a kind of self-awareness that, hey, this is a film, and making moves to communicate that.
Yeah.
You know, photography, the same thing. Almost anything that's like.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Over in the way we're talking about.
That's exactly right. That is what Cavell says. Cavell says self-consciousness ruins the medium in the sense of requiring excessive interpretation, in a sense of inviting, of requiring excessive subjectivity. Right? And then when films sort of began to wink at you by, you know, quoting from each other and requiring you to sort of have this expert knowledge in film history, right? Then, you know, I mean, then it becomes like a Malevich, right? Which you can't really just see on its own. You have to understand in terms of a expert development of painting in the 20th century, right? It's not, I mean, I think the point that, you know, one is tempted to make is something like, the people who say my kid could paint that, right, are right because they don't see, you know, they don't see it in this tradition, right? But the film is something that you say, wow, this is really speaking to me immediately. I don't need to know anything about it, right? I don't need to know anything about the film to sort of appreciate what's happening there. Yeah, and that's its power. Right? So this is a popular form of art, not an avant-garde form of art. You know.
Perhaps, you know, it's as if to say that these mediums have to be unconscious to have the kinds of effects.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I think I would wonder how to put it, what does it mean for us to be acting as if the mediums we're working in don't have an unconscious, or that it may, even if they're reflexive and so forth, that doesn't mean that in the future they won't have proven to do things that we can't imagine now.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I understand you right, you're saying nothing, but what's to keep us from hoping that a new medium will arise that will satisfy us?
Or even that what we're describing as over, you know, because, you know, if films kind of helped us to rethink marriage and divorce, not by being consciously trying to do so, not in a didactic way, but for other reasons, you know, being symptomatic in some way, and I think we're saying had that effect in part by not being conscious of doing that work on the culture and not doing that work on politics or something, or on gender. That to say that that's over is to say that we understand the work that the mediums we are engaging with now are doing because they're reflexive. And I would wonder if that's true. I don't know, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question about whether a medium can sort of continue to do its work in the unconscious of a culture. That's a really interesting. That's a really interesting question. I don't really know the answer. I mean, I think that one way to think about that would just be to talk about sort of the need that is not being met at a sort of socially produced level, that kind of gets shifted into other kinds of things. And I do want to think of cultural production as satisfying a need, right? And we don't really know what social media is exactly. Yeah, so maybe we're in the early days of what will become a medium that can be identified that will, I mean, it's clearly satisfying something. And I mean, and I'm not sure that all the people who are going to see, Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn in the 30s and 40s were sure how they were being satisfied. They just knew they were being satisfied. All right. And then there were all the people who were saying, "Oh my God, you're going to movies, you're rotting your brain. Read some Jane Austen or something." So we just don't really know in the moment either. Yeah. So this is again why it has to be in some ways retrospect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Things to say? Okay.